Anyway, I would like to introduce Roland. I have the pleasure of being part of a group that meet 6:30 a.m. on Mondays that Roland is part of, and he's brought a lot of wisdom and interesting ideas to that. When I talked to him a while ago about having a topic or two, he sent me back a list of, I think, something like 6 or 8 and really interesting topics that either he or his wife Tandy would, or the two of them together, might be able to present. And I don't know, I thought they were all worthy of having a run at some stage. But today's is the one that he said was most sort of ready to go. And this idea of flourishing, I'm intrigued by. I won't try to explain that, I'll leave that to Roland. But Roland's got an interesting background. Correct me if any of this is wrong, Roland, but growing up in the UK in a Jewish family, and I'm saying his dad took him to Israel for a visit instead of having a bar mitzvah because they weren't a particularly religious Jewish family. And he's worked in various places in various fields, including Papua New Guinea and teaching in Cairo. And I might just leave it there and hand over to Roland to take us off. Thank you very much, Roland, for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to this.
Oh, thank you so much, David, and hello, everyone. And it's lovely to be joining Theology on Tap again. Yeah, it's mostly the information that David supplied is quite enough to be getting on with. As he said, I grew up in a Jewish family, culturally Jewish, but not much spirituality there. But later on, when I did accept Jesus as my Messiah, not directly from a Jewish evangelistic viewpoint, but from a mainstream evangelical associations at university, and when I got to Papua New Guinea in 1972. And since then, I've, as Dave mentioned, I've done a lot of teaching. Teaching has really been my stock and trade, adult education, and to a certain level, management of rural socioeconomic development programs, and later on consultancy. And the whole thing about flourishing has come about through all those experiences, really. The intersection in my own life of the 3 stories we're going to be retelling. The wealth-based story, which is of course, our predominant social societal value, but also the local stories I've come to learn and respect, both through work and through Tandy's experience. Thank you, Tandy, for joining us. And the shalom story from my own heritage, in a way. As I read and continue to read the Old Testament with the eyes and the context of the New, but with the hopefully the what's left of the Hebrew values, the Hebrew worldview that can inform us. So I'll kick off with this presentation. Please use the hand up system. If you've got anything to say along the way, you can raise your hand by choosing that option in Zoom. And I'm delighted, very happy to stop and have some dialogue along the way. I think, in fact, that would be the best way to go rather than me just blathering on from A to Z. So, let's start at the beginning. What do you think when you hear the word flourishing? What implications, what associations come up in your heads?
Well, I was going to immediately say garden, so there you go.
Yeah.
But I'm also thinking of young children and kindergarten and early childhood.
Beautiful. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah, Paul?
So just that ability to experience joy, sort of, I suppose it's a bit beyond just being happy, but happiness with a thickness to it. Yeah.
Wonderful. Super. Others? Any? Okay, well, that's already a multi-layer of meanings and implications about flourishing. The idea of growing, the idea of joy, the idea of a satisfaction in there. But also, I also think of it as a sort of beautiful interrelationship in a way of elements in a system or elements in a larger whole that somehow work together. It's not just a single plant, but we say, yes, a garden, which was my immediate thought in a way. Yeah, so there's an element, I reckon, of order, of synergy, of synchronicity, of all those ideas coming along. And I'd say that flourishing is a pretty universal preoccupation or dream through every society that we know. I think it's a universal aspiration. So we're going to look at 3 stories, and don't worry, I have very few slides with text on them. So you can sort of switch off in a way and put your glasses away and just enjoy the pictures. So we're looking at 3 stories: flourishing as wealth, flourishing as union with community and the cosmos, for want of a better way to put it, and flourishing as shalom. And these are very distinct, powerful, and interconnected stories, but still we can trace them as different antecedents and roots. The first people to start thinking about the good life and happiness and so on, it won't surprise you, Greek philosophers. Here's Democritus, who started thinking about what the seat of the good life was. Everyone said, yeah, where does the good life begin? So he thought it was in a person's soul, and the word for soul in Greek was daimon, from where we get demon. And we also get the idea that Aristotle came up with, which is eudaimonia, which is still a concept, 2,500 years later, still a concept which occupies a great number of psychologists, especially. So Aristotle took on Democritus's idea, and I think eudaimonia has been thought of as happiness for a long time, but I reckon it's better translated as flourishing. And flourishing has become quite a fashionable concept to think of. The Croatian theologian Miroslav Volf has written a book about flourishing. In fact, he's now written 2 books about flourishing, and there have been articles and so on. So Aristotle thought of eudaimonia as the highest goal, in a way, of humanity. He thought, okay, if you're virtuous, it was a virtue-based thing. If you're virtuous action in your actions, in your principles, he thought things like prudence, temperance, courage, and justice, then you could aspire to eudaimonia. But he made it clear that it was a fairly rare, exalted sort of state. It wasn't something that the general mass of the population it could enjoy. And this eudaimonia, it did assume a freedom to obtain and practice those virtues. So therefore, freedom to study, a freedom to train physically, which of course was very valued in Greek society. And in the same way, freedom was this kind of freedom, and by implication, this eudaimonia, was denied to most people, whether through circumstances or through active exclusion from the free domains of their society. Slaves, for instance, women, the young and elderly were just considered completely beyond the possibility of attaining this good life. And the of this eudaimonic tradition flourishing, you could think of as Abraham Maslow. He's remembered now as the originator of this idea of the hierarchy of needs, which is the idea that you can't get higher order needs up this hierarchy, up this ladder, without attending to the lower order ones first. So you'd start there with physiological needs, the air, water, food, shelter, sleep, and so on. And having assured those, you could move up to the safety needs and so on, and then move up through love and belonging, and then to esteem, and then finally and supremely to what he calls self-actualization, the idea of complete fulfillment of personal potential. And you can see, of course, the strong influence of the Greek eudaimonic vision in Abraham Maslow's theory, but it's still very influential. But once again, an individualist, an individualized idea that only a few fortunate, exalted individuals could actually get to the top of that pyramid. And it's an interesting to note that none of the Greek philosophers mentioned wealth as a factor in well-being, nor Maslow. In fact, Democritus, the first guy that we looked at, said specifically, the good life consists not in flocks nor gold, but in the seat of the soul. So he pretty well specifically ruled out material wealth as having anything to do with his vision of happiness. So this is the idea of the modern world's happiness. It is, of course, extremely relevant at this point when we see all the oligarchs who are being banned, and this happens to be the yacht of one of the oligarchs who has come under the sanctions. I think his name was Asher Usmanov, and he built this thing called Dilbar, which is his mother's name, and this has now been impounded somewhere, I think in Hamburg. So the big question is, how did we get here? How did we get from Greek philosophers who are mostly very simple livers materially and advocates of a simple life, certainly not dependent on wealth, to this horrendous state of affairs? Of course, Jesus didn't condemn wealth outright, but he certainly pointed out the dilemma of the wealthy, and took the side of the poor. And what that, I think, did was it gave enough of a negative message, maybe an ambivalent message from the point of view of the church in an era where great wealth and power contrasted with grinding poverty among the great majority of people in Western Europe. And of course, the great wealth and power, much of it was in the domain of the church. So you can say, yeah, the church didn't do itself any favors in the medieval days, or even more recently, when it might have preached against or advocated against wealth and power, and certainly had a great deal of it. This is the play The Merchant of Venice, which gives some very interesting reflections of societal attitudes, not only towards Jews, of course, but towards merchants generally. They were seen as a shifty, questionable class of person. There was certainly no great moral acclaim attached to the business of free enterprise or to wealth accumulation. So these ideas, wealth, usury, interest, profit, were pretty dirty words and dirty ideas until the age of capitalism. And then we get three colossal gear shifts in the age of capitalism. First of all was the trading company, which was sanctioned by the British and the Dutch crowns and a couple of other countries, which was the outgrowth of all the discoveries. Oh yeah, we need to set up trading posts, and they were the first really multinational corporations. They were the first mega publicly owned, jointly owned companies who had to raise money from any subscribers for their activities. And many would say the whole thing was sanctioned by a Calvinist or Reformed or Protestant faith, which had a much more relaxed and even positive spin on the business of working out your own salvation. The second big gear shift was Adam Smith and the Enlightenment, of which he was, of course, part of in the late 18th century. And so that all coincided between the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, the Agricultural. Adam Smith specifically said, the free market, the invisible hand, as he called it, is going to be the best way to improve that wealth of nations. So don't tinker with it. Let the market sort itself out, and we'll all get wealthy, or at least those of us who matter will get wealthy. But in the class-based society of England, the source of wealth was still much more important to, for instance, Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. You had to be not only wealthy, but you had to have the right type of wealth. In the US, with its relative absence of class, this didn't apply. The earliest mega industrialists were able to carry on their trade in the US with much more freedom from class and government restrictions. In fact, the Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk that we see now are just the entrepreneurial descendants, if you want. They're just the inheritors of people like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. And the third big gear shift was in the 1980s with the Washington Consensus, this undoubtedly strong, close meeting of minds between Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan here. They presided over and actively encouraged complete deregulation of the global financial system, of the economy, and it also coincided with the collapse of the Soviet system, of course, or maybe it caused it even, the collapse of the Soviet system. So you have not only the Washington Consensus, as it was called, between Thatcher and Reagan. You had the deregulation of banking. You had Milton Friedman, whose supply-side economics became much more influential than John Maynard Keynes, who'd been the previous boss of the world's policies economically. He was replaced by Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek as well, but Friedman was more active and younger. And the most important revolution was brought in by a guy called, no one's ever heard of him now, called Malcolm McLean. He invented the container. And the container and its possibilities to lower shipping costs and times basically has revolutionized world trade and has been the real driving tool behind globalization. So here we are. Wealth rules, the wealth-based story is dominant. But there are cracks in the story. There are cracks in the story. And the first crack is the economic inequality that is growing year by year, day by day, between the moneyed classes and all the rest. No need to go really into details like that, except if you can want to know more, look up Oxfam, which has carried out a great deal of research and campaigning about global inequality. One of the early doubters, one of the early reformist economists was a guy called J.K. Galbraith, a Canadian, who wrote books like The Affluent Society and the New Industrial State, really questioning and debunking the conventional wisdom that the consumer was king. In fact, he said, no, the producer is king, and they are dragging us the way that they would like to. More recently, we've got this guy, Thomas Piketty, who's French, and he wrote a book called Capital in the 21st Century. And Piketty basically said that just what we've been saying, except he backs it up with a mountain of data. And simply the level of data research that he's managed to drag up from everyone's national accounts and so on makes for an enormously strong case to say that global inequality has never been higher and that something has to be done. What Piketty advocates is a wealth tax. He advocates taxing the wealth of billionaires or of the richest, whatever, 0.1%. Interestingly, it's a policy that the Australian Greens have picked up on and is now part of their policy package. How are we doing? The second crack in the story is the collapse of community. The collapse of community. This is a very, very influential book by Robert Putnam, who put it out, I think, in 1995. There's Putnam. He's saying what used to be a big network of clubs, churches, associations, and so on, which formed part of the social life. In fact, they formed the whole of the social life of people, especially before World War II and afterwards, the baby boomer generation. More recently, this has completely collapsed. Social capital is much weaker now than it used to be. So the subtitle of this book, Bowling Alone, is The Collapse and Revival of American Community. And what Putnam finds in the US, you would find many parallels in the UK, in Australia, in Western Europe. Society has become seriously fragmented. The tools, the organs that are used to hold it together have become disused and frittered away. Then you have, of course, mental illness, which to me is a very, very pertinent, very accurate indicator of the health of a society. If a society is healthy, there will be low levels of mental illness and vice versa. And lastly, and very familiarly, sadly, you've got the eco-catastrophe before our very eyes. No need to go into that. But that is ultimately, I think, probably the most serious crack in the wealth-based story. How are we traveling, guys? Any Any comments or wishes to make any remarks on this at this point? No? Well, do raise hands whenever you'd like. Oh, yes, Paul.
So, Roland, one of the responses is to, like Oxfam and other agencies, to pursue a sort of a community development approach to the inequality. Do you see whether that's part of the solution or really tinkering with the problem? That's a question.
I think they are part of the solution. I think they're part of the solution, but I think you need to go a bit deeper and build up, promote, and retell alternative stories, validate essentially a different story, because some people think that the what Oxfam and them are doing is a bit of deck chair rearranging on the Titanic, maybe. That's what you're afraid of. That's what I'm afraid of. And I think at this point, we need some more courageous steps away from it. Quite what? I mean, clearly there needs to be much more encouragement of and revival of community in every society. Thank you, Paul. Anyone else with ideas or remarks at this point? There'll be plenty of time at the end. Otherwise, we'll just press on. So, over against this wealth-based stories, it's of course difficult because there's no hegemonist domination as you find with the wealth-based story, but there are a good few elements that are common to all the local stories. And the first one is that our society and our economy and our intellectual structures, by and large, think in silos, don't we? So classically, there's been this pretty total, and still is, total celebration, for instance, a separation rather between mind matters, between body matters, between material things and the spiritual dimension. Now, the local stories take a very different take on all this. They'll still acknowledge all the different things, all those different elements, but hold them much closer together. So you could think of it in these terms, or you could even think of it in a much still more integrated way, where all of these factors come up in a single whole. And this is very much a common denominator of the local stories, a different way of seeing the world. The second common denominator of the local stories is they think community, they think collective, they think groups. In Swahili, they'll say mtu ni watu, a person is people. In other societies, they'll say, I cannot be well if my group is poor or worried or attacked. No matter what my own situation is, I cannot be well if my group is not well. And the third distinguishing, I think, fundamental characteristic of these local stories is a reverence for the non-human creation. Land is seen as something extremely valuable. We would say the cosmos is seen as a unity. And in that respect, I think the creation story picks up on those values. So some further common elements that you could think about. First of all, the priority is people, and especially kin. This is a kin group from Afghanistan. The extended, what we call the extended family, but in other places might be called lineages or clans or whatever word they have in their place, is the priority, much more so than larger societal issues or provinces or districts or nations or whatever. Land is seen as a sacred trust from ancestors to the current generation, and of course from the current generation to its descendants. There's no way that land should or can be spoilt or sold. It's not a commodity. It's something to take care of. Of course, First Nations people here in Australia and in other places would say, we belong to the land. The land doesn't belong to us. We are under the care, the guardianship, the oversight of the land itself. The land is our boss. There would be a tendency much more towards egalitarian values. At least the tall poppies need trimming, if not cutting down altogether. Local knowledge needs to be is always much more valued than outside knowledge, because it's been built up in a society, in a culture, in an economy, in an ecology, in such a way as the people will know very well what works in their own situation. I never forget a time when I learned about local knowledge to my cost. In the Solomon Islands, we had a plantation to replant, and the government was pushing hybrid coconuts. They say, use the hybrid, they're much heavier producers and so on, and you'll get much better results. But no one in the local nursery where we were in the Western Solomons, no one was acquiring these hybrid coconuts. No one. When I asked the local chief, he says, doesn't work so well, doesn't work. Well, I thought maybe we can get it to work anyway, seeing as the agronomists think so much of it. So we planted the local coconuts, and not one of them survived. I don't think. They were attacked by a particularly vicious kind of a rhinoceros who would burrow right into the growing point, and it killed them all. And there was a lot of work and time that we put into that. So I learned from that. I could tell you a few other stories I learned from in my ignorance, from local contexts, local conditions, local cultures, local experience. And the last thing is they have a cyclical view of history. This is an Aztec stone calendar, but many Aboriginal, if not most Aboriginal cultures, think of history, think of time in a series of cycles, not just seasonal, but of longer periods. They certainly don't think of it in a linear way, in the way that the Western story thinks of. So these are some of the common elements that come up again and again in local stories. And if we had time, which we don't, I could read to you a number of examples of local stories all the way from Africa, from Asia, from the Pacific, where they have these local dreams, these local visions, but they're not just academic ideas like our well-being. They are tightly held, closely followed principles, foundations of living that become the operative principle for this whole society. So not only are they local as opposed to the wealth-based Western story, but they are far more integral to the everyday business of living than our fancy well-being constructs. And the third story is, what does that say? Someone? The scholars? Any Hebrew speakers among us?
I guess it could be shalom.
Yes, you guessed right. Shalom, indeed. And what does shalom mean to us? Some feedback, please.
It'll be a complete harmony between all elements of the physical and the natural, the social realm.
Absolutely, thank you. Great. Anything else from anyone? Yes, Paul?
So an authentic sense of community, justice, security, all those things.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Anyone else?
So perhaps the idea then of everyone having their own fig tree and be able to sit under it, what that actually means.
Yes. We now have a fig tree, but it's not big enough to sit under quite yet. Eventually, maybe. Something else? Yes, I think we're starting to identify the implications of shalom because it comes from a different thought pattern. It's got many different implications, of course, that go way beyond the conventional translation of peace. I think wholeness gets a lot of it, and of course the implication of Jesus as the Sar Shalom, the Prince of Wholeness. Of course, we were created to flourish. If we think of the third story, the big story to begin the more I reflect on Genesis 1, the more amazing and challenging it is, especially this business of God creating humanity in his image. Because God is a creative God, and we have the potential, almost the call to be creative of people as well. And God being a community of three manifestations, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, created not just Adam, but Adam and Eve. So the first community was five of them, all having a joyful time of fellowship. Excuse me. So Jesus, the Sar Shalom, as I mentioned, the Prince of Wholeness, becomes the restorer, or maybe we can even say the inaugurator and facilitator of this new creation, which he announces the new community, the reign of God. I just put that previous slide in to show, in a way, how far we have fallen from that beautiful vision of creation. And Jesus, as the Prince of Wholeness, comes to restore shalom, the reign of God, the Basileia Theo, constructed not by hardware, not by bricks or mortar, but built on love, built on compassion, built on empathy, hospitality, and generosity. In short, life in its fullness, or abundant life. This is the best sort of pictorial representation I could find of restoring shalom, of restoring harmony, restoring flourishing in a place where people are cleaning up the mess. In a way, I guess the business of the kingdom of God could be seen as God's resolution of the human dilemma, or maybe God's people's resolution of the human dilemma, the eternal tension and conflict that we each feel between what we can see as the vision, what we can see as the possible, the potential, between all of that and the messy, disastrous reality into which we so often tumble, between the high ideals to which we aspire and our consistent failure to realize. Of course, the shalom story hasn't ended yet. We're left with the vision of revelation of the new heavens, the new earth, that it's going to be here. It's going to be right here on earth, not in some disembodied state of heaven, but according to scripture, it's all going to be renewed rather than completely removed. So it's renewed rather than removed, I think. Brian Myers, who's written a book called Walking with the Poor, sees it as a relationship, as a fulfillment, a strengthening, a living relationship between all these different things, between God, other people, community, and creation. I think that's quite possibly a useful way to think about it. So how are we going to integrate these three stories? I've presented them really in a schema here. We have the global, the wealth-based on the one corner, which is certainly in very distant connection or more in terms of opposition to the local stories, which are mostly in the global south, by no means all, but mostly, certainly that's where we're getting our inspiration, I think, for this idea of the local story. And the shalom story. So you have these three stories forming a kind of conceptual space into which we can place ourselves wherever we think is comfortable. So maybe that will be those of us who are more oriented towards shalom, we would choose something that's closer up there. Local groups who have not yet fully into discipleship or into shalom thinking would think more there. And maybe the rest of society would have a much more of an allegiance to the global idea. But I can't help thinking it really looks more like that. That there's more of a proximity, more of an affinity between shalom and local stories. Well, they're different, of course. There's more of an affinity between those two groups than to the global. Yes, Paul?
So, Roland, the Greek philosophers had a sort of a dualism about life that you haven't quite mentioned. You talked about their understanding of flourishing.
That's right.
Whereas shalom has this more integrated, non-dualistic understanding.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Can you chat a bit about that for a minute?
Yes. Essentially, what you get in from the Greeks, which I was starting to introduce in the context of Eudaimonia, is that they believed that there was this fundamental dichotomy between soul, mind, and between that and the physical. So they did make a very sharp distinction between the spiritual and the physical, which the Hebrew worldview did not. So the Hebrew worldview was holistic, making a generalization there, but I think if we went to study it, we would find it was quite a a valid generalization against the Greek worldview, which was dualistic. And it's really interesting in the Gospels how Jesus, while paying a certain lip service to the dualism, in fact, sticks to the holistic Jewish approach. So what's the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with body, mind, wealth, strength, and so on. And love your neighbor as yourself. So that was a holistic viewpoint, of course, where he says, I give you life in all, I've come that you may have life in its fullness. Once again, a very inclusive, holistic approach. But the problem was, of course, that Greek philosophy gradually permeated the thinking of the church. So roll forward in a couple of 100 years, 300 years to the councils and so on. And there's endless debates on whether Jesus was physical or spiritual, and how much was physical and how much was spiritual. And essentially, the church, and by extension, the rest of the Western intellectual tradition, has fallen prey to Greek dualism and reductionism. And we're much the poorer for it, I think. Yeah. Does that sort of address it? Thank you for bringing it up, Paul.
Yep. Thank you.
So there we are. It's a way to look at it, and I'm very keen to get your feedback on it. My only worry is that the global wealth story is advancing a bit like COVID. It's just gradually taking over the remaining space of perspectives, which can be enjoyed by whether the shalom or the local stories. It sometimes drowns out those other voices and stories. They treat them as irrelevant or primitive, often sadly with racial and cultural stereotypes and prejudice. And as I sort of implied before, the body of Christ is still enthralled to dualism, to reductionism, to materialist stories, and especially to individualist spirituality. It's become, I surrender all, it's me and God, this kind of relation, this kind of spirituality, which none of which is the intention of the Gospels anywhere, I think. So how do we respond? Okay, this is where I shut up, and we get some ideas from you. If you'd like to put it on the chat, then that's going to be a way of storing a bank of comments and questions, although you can put your hands up too. So over to you guys. Or maybe we can even, in the absence of any free dialogue, we could break you all up into groups with the breakout system.
I think, Roland, with this size group, we could just open the floor to anyone who has a comment. So feel free to type in, or if you just want to jump in like I've just done. It's not an unwieldy size group. I think we can get away with that.
Okay.
So yeah,
cool.
Really interesting to hear your responses while I think about what mine is.
So the questions are, I think, really how valid and helpful is this analysis of stories, and what should our response be? How can we tell and act out alternatives? Paul?
Oh, I'm sorry, I just keep asking questions, but
That's good.
technology sort of got some role in this as well, whether it's fully a servant of the money equation, or perhaps it could be a servant of the local stories as well. But some of us have just read a book about community in Canada, and one of the comments was about a connection with South America and liberation theology, and how everybody in the fervor of the South American time of liberation got together and worked together. There were communities that were reading scriptures together, etc. But with the rise of the iPhone and the internet, everybody now has a television and their own phone, and all that community formation that went on then has dissipated with the draw of technology towards individualism, if I can put it like that.
Yeah.
And that's,
Yeah.
we can all sit at home and just fiddle with our computers. And
that's right, and not relate to anyone face to face. I tell my students, I'm still teaching a group in Papua New Guinea, don't let Facebook be a substitute for face-to-face book. Yeah, face-to-face counts. Everything else, I won't say it doesn't count, but it's certainly not at the same level of face-to-face relationships. Building relationships is key. And I frankly reject the idea that community can be, an interest group of 60,000 people on Instagram or something like that. It's not.
Roland, is you okay if I ask a question?
It's very okay, Richard. Thank you.
Great. Look, I really appreciated that talk, although I missed a little bit at the beginning, but I'd just like to hone in on one thing regarding the breakdown of social cohesion and social structures, which I'm completely agree with you. But there is a dimension there where in my teaching at the university, which has been enormously affected by the change in the way that people communicate and use social networking, what we've really got in many Western societies and some developed countries, I think, is that we have a new generation of people who've actually grown up with extensive social media use. And even if that social media was taken away, they may still not come back to a method of communicating with each other, which is similar to our generations. And I think, there's sort of been a fundamental change in people. And I just wonder, I don't have an instant answer for it, although I have to modify my teaching methods to incorporate like use of mobile phones in lectures and that sort of thing. So we actually are using the things that are just completely natural to them. And I do observe that there is some amount of positive social interaction which does occur on social media. It's not all bad, but maybe it's a kind of how do we actually work with this new kind of person and help them to be able to increase their social cohesion? It's really more my sort of I don't. It's not a very focused question. It's more an observation.
Well, observations are really valuable. I agree with you, Richard, that there is potential. It's like everything, it's like money or transport or whatever. Everything that we can think of that humans have created has a good use or good uses and bad uses. And I think your suggestion that we should, rather than try and tell everyone to put their mobile phones away in their pockets, rather than that, try and use the positive features of it. Thank you. No. Unmute, Tandy. That's better.
Okay. Who started Paul? I wanted to just say maybe what Paul was saying, about the social media and especially on phones. Just been talking to my own people at home in Papua New Guinea. And it's something that's sort of crept away with the new generation where there's no policing, there's nothing that our own people and elders can police because they're ignorant in this. A lot of them are not in tune to the modern tech. And I think I'm coming from another world here and I'm hearing your world, but I'm in two worlds. I represent my own people, but I can understand where you guys are coming from. But it's actually a big problem when you talk about community cohesion and community setting together, where with my own people, where the kinship system is very strong in the clan, that actually sort of the gluing bit that sticks my people together. I'm just talking about my own people at home in Rabaul. But just last week, I had some very disturbing outcome from using Facebook and other, especially Facebook. And people are getting away with it and not understanding. And those aunties and grandmas at home get sending feedback from what the young people are up to, and they don't know how to deal with that. And as you're saying, people are not communicating. They where before our elders would come and sit and talk, now people get away with anything in drugs and pornography and a lot of stuff through the phone and social network. So so when you talk about community and the local stories, where's the corporate body in that? Where's the corporate voice? And I think every society have got protocols that probably are in place or not in place. So that's probably just listening to what you all saying and looking at flourishing. For me to translate that into my language, I would get it more closely to well-being in the shalom sense, in the holistic sense. And as Paul was saying earlier on, it encompasses that harmony, that relationship. And because kinship system works there, that already is the overshadowing our relationship and interconnection with one another. That system is there. It's something that we are familiar with. We can build things on that. To restoring broken relationships, reconciliation, compensation, anything that has to be fixed or mediated upon, it's already there. The system is there, protocols are there. But the social media is actually corrupting it. It's starting to dilute that sense of belonging, that sense of grounding in a culture that's as a social system that's existed for decades, hundreds of years, I guess. Anyway, that's just what I wanted to say. But for me, flourishing is well-being in the holistic sense, like Bonikin in my language. It's much closer to shalom. It incorporates everything from physical, spiritual, social, mental. But it's the relation. It's about relationship.
I think, thanks, Tandy. I think the key to it essentially is to take those visions and values that exist in the local realm and focus them into some practical applications and strategies which can move these societies and move these stories forward without losing the core of them, so as to make them relevant, to make them usable, to make them applicable in today's technological society. So you're not sweeping them out, but you're starting to transform them step by step. And of course, each story, each society is going to have a different application. That's, I think, the vision that you and I have been working on, isn't it?
It's interesting what Richard is saying too, in terms of teaching tools. And it's almost like you're being creative in how you teach today's world. And even thinking of that in terms of looking at the indigenous approach to research and studies, it's taken another new leap in terms of not just sticking to the Western ways of research, doing research, but taking an indigenous approach to research to come up into focus in recent years too, acknowledging those ideas and those knowledge systems in existence. It's interesting, like this is all over, I don't know, what you're doing, but every community has a story. They have to start. Where's a story?
Yeah.
David, where you are, there's a story. But you seem to just come from somewhere and there's something before. Isn't that interesting? And I was at a group this afternoon with my own tribal women from home. There's a community in Brisbane. And I said, why don't we create a map of Brisbane where all the Tolais are here? And there's a strong legion. Leaders are leaders for people, not leaders just to glorify themselves. And represent people there. There are people with voices, people with no voices. There are poor people, there are people with no skills, there are people who are just don't exist.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think it's going back down to the local level.
Yeah. Absolutely. Johannes Reimer, who's a big exponent of holistic mission in Europe and Russia, says a community should be 1.5 kilometer radius from a focal point, which is really localizing it, isn't it? Maybe a few more kilometers if we use cars or bikes, but you can see the idea. And you can see how communities developed in Western Europe in that way, without sort of, really glorifying that sort of thing. And even the older towns in Australia, little towns like Uralla and Bingara and places like that, they were that size. They were that size, and people would cheerfully walk around it to one another. Yeah, thank you, Tandy. Anyone else want to join the conversation? I'm glad I've got headphones on today because the rain's lashing down outside now.
Okay, well, I think that might be
it.
a natural end. Thank you very much, Tandy, for bringing that different perspective in. Perhaps a bit later in the year, we might hear a bit more from you at a Theology on Tap. I think the Indigenous perspectives are something that we haven't had enough of. Roland, that's been really refreshing. Just a little observation of mine to add to the others is that I think it's the bite size of the what's the piece of content, the story or the time together or whatever, is what I find has been reduced dramatically. So we don't have, I scroll down my Facebook and you just take these little snippets and I skip the long stories because it's easier to keep scrolling, and conversations can be the same. But in a traditional time where stories were a lot longer and we could take the time and we would walk to places together and tell those stories. So I think it's reading the books rather than the online news stories, etc.
The bite sizes, yeah, of course.
Yeah,
everything is.
Yeah. So thinking about how in my life I can stretch to more books, less short things, more long conversations, less trivial ones. So anyway, but that was a beautifully wide-ranging conversation. We appreciate that. So Paul, do we have a confirmation for next month, or is that something that people will eagerly await seeing the announcement?
So we actually have a speaker for next month. So this is Luke Garsky. He is a senior respiratory physician at Princess Alexandra Hospital. He lives within the Catholic tradition of the Christian faith, and he's been an active advocate for palliative care in the context of the emerging legislation towards voluntary assisted dying. So Luke has found himself an activist when he perhaps didn't imagine that would be so. And he'll be sharing his story and opening up that space of end of life